things like food throwing actually is a very normal part of a child's development, as frustrating as it is. And I know we're digressing a little bit, but things like food throwing, they're often throwing the food partly to see what happens. Is there going to be a physical change? Does the food change when I throw it? Does it come back?
Hi everyone, welcome to White Swan by Shaleni. In today's episode, I have a very special guest. She's all about helping parents to navigate the tricky world of kids' nutrition. From picky eaters to balanced meals, she's got the answer to everything. I'm very excited to have Vanessa McNamara, a leading pediatric dietitian who's been helping parents from past 24 years, and she's here today to share her expert tips on how we can have a healthy, balanced diet, as well as how our kids can have a healthy relationship with the food. So without further ado, let's welcome Vanessa. Hi Vanessa, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
How has your day been like today?
It's been a busy one. It's nice to be here though.
Oh, great. So Vanessa, in the past, we all had we all lived in a joint family where mothers and grandmothers, they used to be involved with the food. And then we moved to nuclear families where both the parents were working and there were change of habits of food. And then what happened was there was marriages, inter-religion marriages where fusion of food was there. So got a little confusing for the kids, especially if one spouse is vegetarian and the other spouse is non-vegetarian, as to what should we feed the kid. So I think it's a very difficult job to be a dietitian. How did you choose to be one then?
It's a very good question. I mean, it goes back a long way. I've been a dietitian for 24 years. But interestingly, I suppose I've always loved food. I've always loved cooking, and my family have always been very much about cooking good food at home. So I suppose that was a really healthy start, an easy start for me. But actually, when I was about 16 years old, my father, we went on a family holiday to China and travelled around. And as soon as we came back, my dad mentioned that he'd been having chest pain, and within a week, and just before he turned 50, he had to have a quadruple bypass surgery because he had 3 blocked arteries. So as a result of that, being quite young and needing quite significant heart surgery, our family had to make lots of changes to our diet and lifestyle. And we'd always, eaten quite well, but I think, we loved cheese and creamy dishes and things like that. So we all made quite a few changes, and I think I just developed a real interest in nutrition and how it can impact our health for a start, and just some really positive changes that we can make, but how we can stay healthy as well. So that just evolved, and then I was able to get into the course that I wanted to do, and it just evolved from there.
Oh wow, that's an interesting story. So Vanessa, tell us, what is the meaning for you, according to you, for a definition of a healthy child?
A healthy child, it's very multifaceted, I think, and it's probably a much more complex answer than we think it is.
Exactly.
I think a healthy child, I guess we need to look at, physical well-being, as well as mental well-being, as well as, I suppose, a safe environment and a secure environment. I guess a healthy child would have a safe, secure upbringing. They would have a community around them to provide support. They would have access to resources where they can have their health checked and they can access medical care. They can access food and an abundance of fresh food. And that, I suppose, and even an access to healthcare with things like mental well-being as well, access to opportunities to be physically active as well. And so not all children, have the access to all of those resources. So I would say a healthy child is one that is brought up in that environment where there's accessibility and support.
Very nicely spoken, because, in today's date, not everyone has that access to an environment where they can get everything. Right. And especially when you're living in cities where you can't have access to the gardens, to the parks, Right.
But we also, I think, interestingly, in cities, we might have an over-access to certain things as well. You know, every corner there's a different coffee shop or restaurant, so we can have almost an overabundant access to food, which is not necessarily ideal as well.
Right. So when we come to infants, when and how should we introduce solids to vegetarian and non-vegetarian infants?
So, I mean, this is a confusing area because I think we're always hearing of different times to start solids with our babies. You know, most guidelines say somewhere between 4 to 6 months is the right time to introduce solids to your infant. But for me, I would say that really comes down to where your infant is at developmentally. So I think the time is right is when they're meeting certain milestones. Yes. So they're able to keep their head upright with support so that they've got some strength to be able to handle solids. And, you know, showing kind of starting to bring their hands to their mouth and starting to bring toys to their mouth is often quite a good developmental sign as well. And just, I guess, you know, there is an increased interest in food, which can be helpful. And even things like, you know, if you offer a spoon to a baby and they open their mouth, that instinct to do that shows that they might be ready as well. And also sometimes they just show signs of not feeling satisfied with the milk that they're getting. So they might need to feed more regularly, or they're just not quite satisfied at the end of a feed. So they're starting to need more than what they can get through milk alone.
Okay. But what kind of food for vegetarian and non-vegetarian child?
So I suppose, I mean, I feel like it's a very cultural thing, the types of foods that we start with, and there's no right or wrong answer. And thankfully things have changed. I think, you know, probably 15 or 20 years ago, you'd pick up a book about feeding babies and it would be a very complicated stepwise introduction to certain foods. Thankfully, that's gone out the window. And now it doesn't really matter what you introduce when. I think the most important thing really is that we're introducing a source of iron from 6 months because babies can no longer get enough iron at 6 months from their milk of choice. So that's where we need solid food to help to provide an iron source. So, you know, it doesn't really matter whether you're vegetarian or non-vegetarian. You can get iron from non-vegetarian sources, obviously like meat and chicken and eggs. But vegetarian sources can also be a great source of iron. So things like legumes, lentils, chickpeas, tofu, green leafy vegetables, nuts and seeds. So I often recommend, even if you're bringing your baby up non-vegetarian, it's always a good idea to give a combination of both the animal and plant-based sources of iron.
All right. So it's mostly mashed foods, basically? You mash them up every time when you...
Yeah, this is very individual. So there's a real push, I suppose, or there has been probably the last 10 to 15 years for the baby-led weaning approach, which is where there are no purees and there is no feeding. There are no bowls. It's just placing finger food in front of the baby that the rest of the family is eating and getting them to feed themselves. So, you know, there's that baby-led weaning approach compared to, I suppose, the traditional pureed approach, which is, you know, starting out with a smooth puree and gradually moving through the textures to become thicker and lumpier. And so I think there is definitely a place for both approaches. And my personal preference is to have a combination of the two, is to have a bit of a happy medium. I think it's very helpful to be able to give smooth purees to a baby and to gradually increase the textures as the baby tolerates them. But it's really important to get some finger food in there as well and get them feeding themselves, get them exploring the food, get them messy, you know, let them explore the food sensorily, because that's how they're going to learn and that's how they're going to trust the food more and they're going to enjoy it more in the long run.
Very true. So what are the big no-no foods according to you shouldn't be given to a child who is under 12 months old?
Yeah, so there are a few. So I suppose one of the most important ones is salt. So a little baby's kidney is just not developed enough to be able to handle salt in their diet. So we don't want to be adding any salt, any sauces, any stocks to their food, even though we feel like it's quite bland.
Yeah,
It's not to them. They're born with quite a bland palate. So we can be adding things like herbs and spices, though. That's completely fine, but just not the salt. There will be some foods that do have salt in them. So I guess things like bread and cheese. And it doesn't mean we can't give those foods, but I would probably limit their salt intake to those foods rather than any salt that's actually added to their diet.
How about sugar?
Yeah, sugar's another one.
Sugar's become the biggest enemy right now.
Right, yeah. And I'm not against sugar at all. I think there's definitely a place for sugar in our diet, but not for a baby under one. I'm all for giving a baby some cake, real cake on their first birthday. It's totally no harm in that. I guess the thing we need to remind ourselves about sugar is that it provides no nutrients. So it's not we don't need sugar in our diet. I mean, interestingly, babies do have a natural preference for sweet. So amniotic fluid is sweet, breast milk is sweet.
Right.
So they do have a preference for sweet, but they can get enough sweet from naturally occurring sugars like fruit and, lactose in dairy products and things like that, and that's enough. But I would probably just suggest holding off until you need to.
How about the alternatives to sugar? Like you have honey, you have maple syrup, or you have stevia.
Yeah. I mean, honey, definitely a no before they turn 12 months. There is a bacterial risk there. There's a risk of botulism. So because their immunity is not strong enough under the age of 12 months, we say avoid honey at all costs. After the age of 12 months, we can be adding sources of sweet like honey or maple syrup. But I guess it's important to realise that actually sugar is a natural product as well. So honey, maple syrup, sugar are really all going to have a very similar impact. There are perhaps some nutritional properties that honey and maple syrup might carry that refined sugar doesn't. But I think we just really want to keep whatever sweetness it is that we're using, we want to keep it to a minimum, help them to enjoy it for the taste that it is, and I guess not to get too hung up on don't eat that, it's high in sugar, it's bad for you.
Right, then the psychology of the kids gets related to food like that, like they're eating sugar and they feel that, okay, it's going to be doing harm to my body. Yeah,
this creates a real negative association with food, and sometimes we can be almost quite punitive in a child's love of sugar, and we might start to use sugar as either a reward or a punishment, which gives quite the wrong message, right? So we just want to be able to treat sugar, I think a food that contains sugar, there's a place for it in a child's life, just as much as there's a place for broccoli. And obviously we want them to be having lots of broccoli because it's super nutritious. We don't want them to be having heaps of sugar because it's not very nutritious. But the more we put broccoli on the pedestal and say, eat your broccoli and then you'll get your sugar, it makes the sugar much more appealing. So if we just kind of include it normally as part of a balanced diet, it puts less of this good food, bad food kind of label, or healthy and unhealthy label, which we really want to avoid those negative terms when we're speaking to children about food.
I think I need to learn that, because every time my child eats something sweet and I'm like, oh, there's so much sugar going in your body. And then he goes on complaining, Mommy, why do you always say sugar, sugar, sugar?
Yes, we do tend to get a little bit fixated on it. And I suppose it's, kids are generally quite active. It's the kind of food that they're going to burn off pretty quickly. And I think the way that I like to approach sugar is not kind of feeding it on its own. So if we're giving a really high sugar food to a child who's hungry, that's obviously not a great time, because they're going to overconsume it.
Right.
So we want to keep it to a time where they're not hungry, but we're having it because it's fun. But also I think sometimes it can be quite helpful to serve these foods alongside other nutritious foods. So, you know, you might be giving them a source of protein. You might give them some nuts or some nut butter. Obviously, you're not giving whole nuts to young children. You might be giving some dairy products like some milk or cheese or yogurt or something like that. So they've got some protein. You might be giving some fiber as well, so some fruit or some vegetables. And then you might have a piece of chocolate or a sweet or something like that. And it's really just normalizing that it is part of a balanced plate. It's not you're only allowed to have that if you eat the rest of it first. And, you know, sometimes I even say to people, if you're planning to give dessert or a sweet at the end of the meal, experiment a little bit and bring it out together. Bring it out with the main meal and see what happens, rather than kind of holding out, waiting for them to eat the main meal and then deciding whether you bring the sweet out or not. Just kind of bring them out together and open slather, say this is what there is, you decide whether you eat it or not, and see what happens.
They're going to pick up the sweet first, right?
Sure. But the more that happens, probably the less that will be. It becomes less appealing when we put less focus on it.
That's true. That's a good idea. I think next time I'm going to do that. So, but that brings actually to my next question. I was about to ask you that how do we have a balanced meal with them? Like, you know, we want our children to experience all kind of different tastes, different palettes of food that is around. So how do we bring that balanced food for them?
I think, first of all, I guess if we go back to feeding infants, we're not going to be giving them a balanced diet immediately. You know, we will be gradually perhaps working through some individual fruits and vegetables and then introducing perhaps some iron and protein sources and then some carbohydrates. So it can take a bit of time to get there. But what we're ultimately aiming for is a balance of carbohydrates, protein and fiber, or I guess fruit and vegetables. So we want to be making sure that we're providing a balance, and it does depend on the child, and, you know, it really probably depends what age we're talking about. But it would be anywhere from about a third of a plate of each food group. You might have a third protein, a third carbohydrates, and a third fruit and vegetables. But also always adding in a source of fat as well. And so I mean kind of nutritious, healthy fats. So things like olive oil or avocado or oily fish like salmon or sardines or nuts and seeds and things like that. So having a combination of those, I guess, 4 food groups and offering that. Now, obviously, doesn't mean they're going to eat them, right? And I think that a nice and I guess a gentle way of looking at how we provide nutritious foods to our child is looking at not so much what they're eating at a specific meal, but perhaps what they're eating over the course of a week. Because some children will just eat carbs. You know, I mean, it's very appealing to just have carbs, right?
Ask me about it. I love bread.
Children and adults alike, exactly. They might just eat carbs, you know, for a few meals. But then they might just eat protein for a while. And, you know, if we're lucky, they might just eat fruit and vegetables as well.
Right. So what would be the portion of the food? Like, is there any definition of, you know, this much carbs and this much proteins and this much of the other?
It's a very difficult one because, and it's actually one that parents often want to hear, but it's not necessarily information I love to provide because parents do tend to get a little bit fixated on that quantity that we recommend and feel terrible if their child is not eating that amount.
We turn off feeding guilty.
Yes, and whether it be overeating a certain amount or undereating a certain amount, the parent is always made to feel guilty, you know, if they're not meeting that specific amount. So I think, you know, I guess a little helpful guide is when they're a little bit younger is aiming for about one of your child's fistfuls of each food group per year of age. So this obviously only goes so far, but if they're 1, they've got quite a little fist, but you might give them 1 handful of carbohydrates, 1 handful of protein and 1 handful of vegetables, just as a general guide. But I would really only use that as a loose guide, and then you really want to base it on how much they usually eat. And now I guess this is important as a parent as well, is, you know, realizing that they might eat a huge amount one week and then really nothing the next week. And we all know as parents that our children go through growth spurts.
Right.
They're often just short, but we can really notice it in the amount of food that they eat. So it often comes down to whether they're growing at that time or not, how active they are.
Right, active.
Yeah, if they're teething or not. You know, there are times when they're really, really uncomfortable, really grizzly. You know, they might be a bit sick as well, and their appetite really drops. And that can be really worrying as a parent.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and so I think the thing is just continue to persist. So it's continuing to provide the food. And I mean, it's frustrating because you think, but you liked that last week. Why do you not like it this week?
Right.
Try not to overanalyze it, I would just say, because equally, as well as, you know, they might eat a lot last week and not much this week, the same goes for they loved broccoli last week and they won't touch it this week.
Wow, that's a wonderful idea, to actually take a fist of all the items and then feed it to them. But usually we see that either kids turn out to be picky eaters or they turn out to be obese. Not I don't mean everyone, but we see these two extremes in kids. So if I come to picky eaters first, how do we introduce food to them? Because anytime I try to introduce, my son is a picky eater. So anytime I try to introduce a new food to him, he just takes a very tiny bit and then he says no straight away.
Yeah, and I actually think that every child goes through a picky phase. I really do. And I think particularly from the age of 12 months, probably up to the age of 2.5, could even be longer.
Okay.
You know, I think that's a particularly obvious time when they'll become more resistant, and they're becoming more resistant to everything at that age. They realize that they can be a little bit independent, they can have an opinion, and food is a really easy way for them to kind of assert their independence, assert their opinion, and just say no. Right. That's when things like food throwing happens as well. And, you know, things like food throwing actually is a very normal part of a child's development, as frustrating as it is.
Yes.
It's actually important, you know, for a couple of reasons. And I know we're digressing a little bit, but things like food throwing, they are, you know, they're often throwing the food partly to see what happens. You know, is there going to be a physical change without them obviously even thinking about it? But does the food change when I throw it? Does it come back? What happens physically when I throw food? But the other thing obviously is watching your response, you know, and ultimately what they want is a reaction.
Right.
Which we usually give. We either laugh or we get frustrated or we get angry.
Very true.
And so I think, you know, on that note, I would just say try not to react, try to be very neutral, try to just continually bring the food back if you can, and just have some kind of a mantra like food stays on the table, you know, and keep bringing it back to reduce that reaction. But so I think it's worth being understanding that it's normal and they are definitely going to go through that phase at some stage. I myself have a picky eater, which makes me very empathetic to parents because it can be really frustrating, particularly if they're not growing very well. It's just provides that added stress. So that's really difficult to navigate. So I guess part of it can be normal, you know, just saying no, disliking something this week. And I think what can be really difficult is when they're not eating anything, it can start to develop some bad behaviours, I suppose, in that if they start refusing everything but we're desperate for them to eat, we tend to clutch at straws and bring out whatever we think they might eat. And we might start to just feed them foods that we know they like. And unfortunately that list gets narrower and narrower, and then before we know it we think, oh my gosh, they only eat 5 foods. And that's where it can be troubling and it can become a problem.
But you know, we go on, how long should we try for? Like how long should we go on trying to introduce new food to them?
Yes, it's worth understanding, I suppose, what's normal and when does it become a problem, and perhaps what are some red flags for that. I think what is important is what I mentioned is just continuing to provide the food that you want your child to eat. There's a feeding expert in the US called Ellen Satter, and she has a really great philosophy called the division of responsibility in feeding, which is basically the parent's responsibility is to provide the right food So that is balanced food, some protein, some carbs, some fruit and vegetables at the right times. So that is having quite a strict schedule, having a specific time for breakfast, lunch and dinner, and then perhaps a morning snack and an afternoon snack, and kind of sticking to that schedule. And their other responsibility is to provide the right environment. So that is hopefully a stress-free, relaxed environment. It's kind of a happy place where children want to come to the table. Also a supportive environment for the child. So they're in a chair that's supportive. They've got foot support. They're able to sit without slipping down. So all of that. So they're kind of, the job of the parent is to provide the right food at the right times in the right environment. And that is where the parent's responsibility ends. It's the child's responsibility to decide how much they're going to eat and whether they eat at all. And so obviously this fills parents with fear, thinking
the
if I
guilt
just
of them not feeding them properly, and then they're sleeping in hunger, or they turn up not sleeping well.
Yes,
and we just go and rewind, and we're like, okay, he didn't eat this that time, or he didn't eat that time, so I should have made more effort, to make him eat that, or maybe I should have given something else that he liked. All those questions just run in our mind if we see their health not going bad, but they are not able to cope up with things, not sleep well, they're not active the next day.
Yes. So I think it is obviously that is helpful approach for the majority of children, but there are always going to be children where we need to take it that extra step.
Right.
So if there is a child with quite severe sensory issues, if they're really anxious by meal times because they're faced with all this sensory input that their brain is not able to process. Meal times can be really sensorily overwhelming for some kids. They're noisy. There's lots of different things going on. It's often dinner time, particularly they're tired. So it's really hard to process all the sensory input. There's also lots of different colours on their plate and lots of different textures. Then a parent saying, come on, just eat your food. So it can be a really overwhelming environment. So, I think if we can step back a little bit as a parent, help to make it relaxing and enjoyable. And I think encourage some sensory involvement with the food is really important part of that process. So getting the child, and the most powerful words that you can often say to a child is, it's okay, you don't have to eat it, and that's so liberating for both the child and the parent. And you say, it's okay, you don't have to eat it, but what should we do with it instead? Right. Should we build a tower with our broccoli? Should we paint our plate using the broccoli as the paintbrush, and paint some sauce around our plate? Or, should we play hockey with our chickpeas?
Get creative with food.
Yes, exactly. And I know that can be quite uncomfortable for some parents. It's a bit of a generational thing as well. Grandparents do not like doing that. So sometimes you just have to have a word with them that actually it's a very important part of them getting to know the food and trusting it and exploring it that way. And I often say to parents, particularly if they have somebody else feeding their child, so if they have a grandparent or a helper or someone else feeding their child, it can be quite helpful to say, okay, I don't really mind whether the child eats or not. You don't need to send me a photo of an empty plate, but I'd love to see a photo of a messy child, because that's showing that they're really interacting and really enjoying their food.
Does that really help? When we give kids and we tell them, okay, this is going to it's going to make you healthy, and, it's going to make you strong. Or like my son is into football. So, most of the time I try this trick of telling him, okay, you eat this, it's going to make you really strong, you can play football really well. But that happens for a day. He might listen to me, but the next day we are back to square.
Yes, it does depend on the child, where they're at developmentally, but you're right. The majority of the time it does not work. You can cater your language to their age. So when they are a little bit older and when things really drive them. So if sport is a real motivator to them, and, rather than saying, eat this and you'll be strong, it's about saying, well, the reason we like to have protein in our diet regularly is because it helps us to build muscle. So what are your favorite sources of protein? How can we get some more protein in to our diet a bit more often?
Wow.
Things like,
Right.
fruit and vegetables. It doesn't help to say, oh, well, you won't get sick very often if you eat fruit and vegetables. Or, we used to say things like eat your carrots and you'll be able to see in the dark. It's not true for a start. Right? So we do kind of need to keep it real for them.
Right,
and just say, we like to eat orange foods because they're really helpful to have healthy eyes, rather than because we can see in the dark.
So now when we come to obesity, we see a lot of kids getting obese nowadays. What kind of food should we offer to them?
So really, we should be feeding a child who's above their most natural weight exactly the same as we should be feeding a child who is below their most natural weight. Really, we want to be getting a variety of nutritious foods in their diet. We want them to be able to follow their hunger and fullness cues, and we want them to be able to trust those cues so that they can stop when they feel like they've had enough. And we want them to be able to enjoy their foods and not see foods as good and bad, and see foods as either a reward or a punishment. And unfortunately, the weight of our child often dictates the way we feed them, but it shouldn't. So we tend to push the high calorie, high fat foods to the more underweight child, and we restrict those high fat foods or high sugar foods to a child who's higher on the growth chart. But really, we just want to be teaching them from a very young age how they can tune in, what makes them feel good, what makes them feel satisfied, what helps to improve their mood when they've, had an energy.
Right. But could you tell us what is the psychology behind a child who is obese? Like, how does he or she sees the food?
Yeah, it depends partly on how they've been brought up and how their relationship with food is. And I know most parents, one of their main missions is really to help a child develop a really positive, healthy relationship with food from the beginning. And so this comes back to when they're babies and we're feeding babies and we're trusting their internal hunger and fullness cues. So we're trusting them when they say they've had enough, we listen to that. And, when they're showing signs of hunger, we give them nutritious food that we know is going to fill them up. So we're kind of really helping them to honour those hunger and fullness cues from an early age so they can feel comfortable trusting it. We also want them to really be able to enjoy the taste of good food. And that's being able to talk about food in a really positive way. And for some parents, that might mean that they need to do some work on their relationship with food first. So we need to be aware of the way we talk about food to our children, and, how we talk about our body, to our children as well. And so if we're always talking about, that this don't eat, I don't eat this food because it makes me fat, or I don't eat that food because it will, give me cancer or give me diabetes or something like that. That's real scaremongering, and it can make a child a bit fearful, of those foods. And we run the risk of things like foods being hidden, and children feeling like they really want that food, but they can't eat it in front of their parents, so they hide it. And that's when that becomes a whole new set of problems. So I guess the psychology of it often does depend how food has been talked about in the home from a young age. So there are definitely issues like that, or children with diabetes, all sorts of conditions actually that could be part of it. But I think a lot of the time it's kind of the behavioural approach that we have from a young age.
Yeah, I think many a times we also blame it on our genes, saying that, okay, fine, the parents were like that, so okay, the kid also turned out to be a little on the heavier side.
And it's very true, it's very much a genetic thing, the size that we are going to be. And there is a set weight point theory where, our weight as an adult, our most ideal weight as an adult is preset. and obviously we can do things to put us above that most natural weight and below that most natural weight. And obviously that's where, as parents, we come in to be able to provide the right food and have a schedule that's stuck to and things like that to help with that. But definitely people come in all shapes and sizes. And I often try to educate parents when we're looking at things like growth charts. It captures the whole population. And because of that, somebody has to be on the 99th percentile for weight and height, and somebody has to be on the first percentile for weight and height. And it really doesn't matter where they are. What does matter is how they track with time. Okay. Because if somebody is, has always been about the, let's say 25th percentile for weight until they turn 10, and suddenly they've gone up to the 90th percentile, that's obviously not ideal. They've really increased on the growth chart. But if they've always been on the 90th percentile, then that is completely normal for them. It's just change on the growth chart over time that we take note of the most.
Right. Because for parents, I think it gets very difficult to limit the child from eating. You're saying no every time, you can't eat this and you can't eat that. I think it hits a child's mind that, I've been restricted to eat everything at home.
Yeah, it's no fun for anyone, is it? It's no fun for the parent to be continually saying no. It's no fun for a child to be continually hearing no, because it just makes them want it more. And, I approach nutrition with adults very similarly to the way I approach it with humans. Adults, kids, we're all humans. But I do think that, I really think that we want to make sure that we're focusing on the good things, focus on what can they be having to be helping them to grow and develop properly, and focus on including lots of fruit and vegetables and lots of nuts and seeds and, dairy products and lean sources of protein, both animal and plant-based sources, unless you're vegetarian.
So what would you say, how many snack times should kids have?
The majority of the time, it's probably having 3 main meals and 2 snacks is great. Some children will need that third snack. So if they're particularly active, for younger children particularly, there's a bit of a magic window of timing when you want to feed children. So generally, roughly every 2 to 3 hours, we want to be giving them a meal or a snack. If it's less than 2 hours, then that's not ideal, because they tend to just graze on smaller portions
and then they don't
more
eat
often and they don't eat properly. So they might have just enough to get them through the next hour, and then they have and often they tend to be just carby snacks, like just having crackers. Crackers have enough just to get me through, and then I'm looking for more an hour later. So we want to make sure that there's a minimum of 2 hours between meals and snacks. And sometimes I know parents will say, no, I'm not feeding snacks because I know they won't eat their dinner if they do. But I think it's always worth trying to give something nutritious, because snacks can be fantastic. And I know a lot of kids are not great at eating dinner because they're tired and there's pressure and all of that. And if you have given them a really nutritious afternoon snack, it takes a lot of the pressure off dinner. And so snacks can be a fantastic way to get some nutrients into children, particularly a picky eater.
But many a times it happens that a child actually looks for a snack right before sleeping. We're putting them to sleep and he says, I'm hungry, can I have something?
That's worth working out whether they are actually hungry, if it's just a putting off bed tactic. I think if you find that they're constantly hungry at that time, you might need to look at their routine. Partly that can be perhaps they haven't had enough earlier in the day and it kind of catches up with them by the end of the day. Perhaps it's been quite a long window since they've had dinner. And so what I would do is, if that is becoming a thing, make an evening snack a scheduled event rather than just waiting until they say they're hungry. Yeah, so you could talk to them depending on their age, obviously, and say, well, maybe we need to start bringing in a snack time before bed. It might be a cup of milk or some yogurt or some peanut butter on toast, or something like that, just to help to give them something before they go to bed. But obviously you don't want that to be too close to dinner.
Right.
If it's half an hour after dinner, then
they haven't finished. I mean, they're not full with the meal.
They might just be holding out for that toast or milk or yogurt later
I usually
on.
end up giving a small piece of dark chocolate to my son right before he sleeps, because I've seen that in him. He's usually saying, I'm hungry right before sleeping, right before I put him to bed. So he'll be like, I'm hungry. So now I have a thing that, okay, I have a small piece of dark chocolate for you so you can have that. But I don't know how healthy it is or how good it is for him.
I mean, there's always a place for chocolate in our diet. Whether it's before bed though or not, or and whether that's as a tactic to get out of bed, I don't know.
Right. So Vanessa, to be very honest with you, I love my cheat days. I love that I can eat everything and anything one day. And I'm sure even my son would want that he can have anything and everything one day. But how can I bridge that gap with my son and I can enjoy the not so healthy, but let's say like a cheat day with him without feeling guilty? How can I do that?
Yeah, I think I guess we do need to be a little bit careful with the language that we use around it. And so if we say to a child, this is a cheat day, it's basically saying, we're being quite naughty today. It's kind of putting a bit of a negative connotation on that. So I suppose we want to be careful not to label it to a child. We might to ourselves, but not to a child. And I think you probably look at certain occasions in our life. So, I mean, something like a party, I would never want to restrict what my child eats at a birthday party or at a family gathering or a festive gathering, where it's all about the food and all about the community. I think, you would want them to just go and enjoy it and eat whatever they can and just enjoy it for what it is. And when you do that, they do tend to be able to stop a little bit earlier. I feel like Halloween is a really great example of this. Often,
ask me, I'm so scared of Halloween.
Often a parent's worst nightmare is Halloween. But it's worth experimenting, and I have done this over the years, is send them out, go their hardest, get as many sweets as they want, and bring it back to the house and kind of talk about what's there and how they're going to eat it, perhaps. And you know what? We've still got food in our fridge from Halloween, and it's September. It's almost time for the next Halloween to come around. Yeah, so I think it does depend how you approach it. And if you start saying, oh, that's terrible, you've got so much, what are we going to do with that, it's awful, it does make it more appealing to the child. But if if these foods are kind of gradually coming out as part of a balanced snack, if you're bringing them out, and you might say to them, okay, they might say, I want my Halloween sweets now. And you say, well, why don't we have it with our snack later on, and we'll have some fruit and we'll have some cheese and we'll have some crackers or something at the same time as well. So they're getting their filling nutritious foods. They're also getting the food that tastes, that they love the taste of, and it's a fun food. So I think I would prefer to approach it that way, rather than just having a day where they just go and eat whatever they want. And I think those days naturally happen anyway.
To ration it out.
Rather than rationing it out, kind of leaving it up to them to ration it out almost naturally, and just saying, enjoy the birthday party.
Right. Makes it easier for them when it comes from them, right? Like, okay, I'm going to eat this much this time and this time. So I think they stick to it more than when we tell them to eat this much that time.
And I think we want to avoid food rules. Honestly, we don't want them to think there are food rules. There are perhaps boundaries around when we eat and where we eat and how we eat. I think it's completely okay to develop boundaries around those rather than boundaries around the food itself.
So Vanessa, you have tagged yourself as a traveling dietitian. Like your website says you're a traveling dietitian. So basically you go to everyone's house and you help people with their diet. So are the kids very happy to see you that, okay, something special is coming up? Or are they like, oh, another healthy food, like I have to have healthy food now?
I hope not. I hope they're not dreading my visit. Obviously, I work a lot with parents, and I do often like to speak to the parent first a little bit about, perhaps we can just develop some healthy boundaries, and help guide them rather than just coming straight in. And, I'm not going to come straight in and tell a child they can't eat their favorite foods. It's all about focusing on the positives of what they can include. Definitely when the kids are a little bit older, I love to include the child, and we sit down and we talk through perhaps maybe what they want to get out of our session together, and we talk through, maybe they might have some ideas as to how they might be able to eat a bit more of a balanced diet, or how they can include a wider variety of foods. And I would always do a brainstorming session with them first before I start throwing advice out there, and always cater it back to their preferences as well, because I'm not going to tell a child who's never eaten fruit to suddenly start eating lots of fruit. And it's just kind of working with the child and working with the parent as to ways that we can gradually start building it in as a normal part of their day. And if they don't like fruit, we can come up with some strategies for perhaps exposing them just a little bit more regularly to these foods, getting them feeling more comfortable with these foods. So looking at the food is a really positive thing. And, a lot of the time children need at least 15 positive experiences with a food before they know whether they like it or not. And that doesn't even mean eating it. That just means having it in their personal space without there being a negative experience like being forced to eat it. So I do try and be positive, and hopefully they don't dread my visit. But I do find it really helpful with younger children to be able to go into the family home and sit with them sometimes at a mealtime and just observe their eating, because I might be looking at, if it's a fussy eater, I might be looking at perhaps the way they're eating, the physical ability to eat. Are they lacking some coordination in the mouth? And, actually they're not eating certain foods because they find it really difficult, or they don't have the strength. Or, is it a sensory thing, or is it a behavioural thing, which is kind of easier to work out watching them in their natural environment.
So watch and go, right? Like you watch and then you prepare the kind of diet that they are supposed to be eating.
Yeah, so then provide advice and some strategies for the parents to work on from there.
Vanessa, you must have transformed a lot of lives. I'm very sure about that. Help people with a lot of food allergies. How does that make you feel?
I feel very humbled that I'm able to do a job that I love. I feel very fortunate for that, because I know that can be quite rare. But it is nice. It is nice to see, hopefully, my mission is just to help families have more positive meal times and, everyone to have a much stronger relationship with food. So I do hope that, that is happening as a result of our sessions together. But also, if we're helping a child, if there's a way that we can help a child to thrive and grow and meet their developmental milestones more easily with food, then it's great. And I think parents are always wanting to take the natural route if possible. So, if they can avoid medication or they can avoid, products and things like that, I think ideally we all want to go for food first where we can.
What are the 3 things that you would tell a parent to do with the food for their child, and how can they have a healthy relationship with the food?
Okay, well, I guess one of the first ones I would say is don't take no for an answer. I think that doesn't mean forcing a child to eat a food or be in an environment they don't feel comfortable in, but continue to provide the food that you want them to eat in a non-pressured way, and watch it evolve. So I think, it's persisting and accepting that phases come and go, I'd say would be one.
Okay.
I would also suggest that parents feel comfortable and confident with the boundaries that they're setting. And, it's okay to tell a child to wait a little bit longer until the mealtime. It's okay to, sometimes say, actually, the kitchen's closed right now. We've got 30 minutes. We've got the length of a Bluey episode to wait until we get to our next snack. So let's just wait then. But let me know what you'd like to include as part of that.
Right.
I would also say really try to tune in to your child's preferences as much as possible, and so feed them with respect. Okay. So if they do have really strong sensory preferences or sensory dislikes, try not to overwhelm them with something that makes them feel really anxious or really uncomfortable, but try and help them to feel more comfortable with that, with kind of some gentle desensitization. And it really might be helpful for parents to reach out and seek support. And there are several professions that can be really helpful in that situation. So obviously seeing a dietitian, but also occupational therapists can be really helpful for kids with sensory issues. Speech and language therapists can be really helpful for kids who might have some physical kind of delays, or they might lack strength and coordination in their oral motor space. And obviously developmental physicians and GPs and paediatricians are all really helpful resources for that as well.
Wow, great. I hope parents keep that in mind. And I would like to give you a small gift.
Oh, please don't. Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Vanessa, for coming.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into all our episodes. I hope you get some great insights about parenting. Please share this episode with all your family members and your friends. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. See you next time.